Féisgur me a cháirstean uamsach mar feicing in noch mór an tain go dearra ar son tíneann. Tain fór ar son tín gona na seisean bheo againn mar phàirt gin hub ar son Foghlam Gàidhlig na phàirt gin Ionad Sàr-mhathais an na Teagasg. Ha na chleach againn fáilte a chuair noch an ólamh Lyster a go bhí códaring agus bríonn mo bhí Scafallachd Labhairt as the Mhion-chànan an na Phrìomh Fo-Ionad. The teacher an the Phrìomh Fo-Ionad an the Canada an den Troi agus Teagasg tro bhían na Frangis agus haar bhín sas an the Phrìomh teacherin ar son illig bhían van Oorsin. Ik zomerose kan je kunt loog is ne peperen als een jarigen ranzige rikke agus bishin gachlechte trik as me koes kenaking agus kutjach as nog bij de hashin Giano called teacheren. Agus han flachting faaltje goed is nog. Hello, Professor Lyster Roy. It's lovely to have you with us tonight. Many thanks indeed for being willing to share with us some of your research and wider research and guidance in regard to scaffolding production in the minority language and immersion education. Welcome, phàilte Phrìomh. I'll just run through a bit of housekeeping just before we start. We are going to record the session tonight, so feel free. You can either have your camera on or off, whichever you're happy with, and the recording will be available. We'll send it out afterwards. We're going to have a Q&A, and you'll see that up at the top in the top bar. Feel free to put your questions in during the session, and we'll come to those at the end. And if you lose your connection, just return to the link that you used to come into the meeting tonight. Gleda, mór an tain go cháirstean. Now, Roy, are you happy to share your slides and we can make a start? Mór an tain.
There we go. Can you see?
Gleda, great, perfect.
And you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm ready to go. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks to both Gwen and Anna for the invitation. I'm very happy to be doing this. I'm just trying to turn something off here. Nope. Okay. Oh, stay here. What did I do? Sorry. Sorry, I just want...
Maybe if you try and minimize that, that might...
How do I do that?
Here, the wee line up. Oh.
I would maybe even just drag it to the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, but it pops up again.
Do you want to try and come out of share, stop sharing, and then try and share again, Roy? Would that help?
Here, it should be something in view. So just speaker. Well, that's you, but I want to minimize it.
Is it that setting in the white, in the blue bar at the top? On a Mac, that the orange button, I think, might be.
No, that would stop sharing the screen. Oh, presenter overlay. Oh, there's me. Just turn it off. Sorry, should I stop sharing and then?
Yes, try that.
You could do that.
Then try
Sorry,
sharing
everyone.
again because it's fine. Don't worry. Yes, and try sharing again because it did work initially.
But I don't want to end the event though.
Oh, please
No.
don't.
No, just press the share button, the one next to end event.
And then the presenter mode, and then your screen, and that should be us.
Right, but
There you
okay.
go. That's you. Is it working for you?
Yeah.
No more pop-ups.
Well, there is a pop-up there because I can see you, but that's okay too.
Super.
Maximize meeting, show more people. Okay, I'm just going to leave this as is and hope I can see everything.
Amazing. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Hello, everybody. I am so sorry for that, but I'm sure that you are used to technological glitches with people over 65 years old. So, my talk, first of all, I want to present myself a little bit more and just say that I've been doing research in immersion classrooms for the past 30 years and mainly in French immersion classrooms, and that's what I'll be sharing with you. And I just want to mention that I'm sorry, are you seeing everything? Are you seeing everything that's on top of my screen too?
We're just seeing your slides, Roy. I don't know if
Okay.
do you want to test just moving on to the next one, or are you happy just to leave that for the moment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few things about myself, that I've done some research. I've been doing research for 30 years in French immersion classrooms. And I want to point out that I was a French immersion teacher for about 10 years in Canada, a French immersion teacher. And I had a lot of questions about immersion. I thought it was very exciting, a wonderful way to learn languages. And at the same time, I couldn't help but be concerned about the quality of the French that my students were learning. I kept thinking that this is such a wonderful program, but surely the results could be better. And so I became very interested, and that's what my career really has been about, is how can we make immersion programs even better so that the proficiency level of our students are even better than they are. And so that's really the essence of my presentation. My colleague, Professor Teagasg, spoke last month about scaffolding comprehension in the immersion classroom, and I'm going to talk about scaffolding production and how to encourage students to use the minority language as much as possible, and how to, as teachers, encourage students as much as possible to use the immersion language. So, there we go. Okay, so the thing about production is that if we don't use a language, we lose it. Okay, we all know this. And so students learn language by using it. And this goes back to Merrill Swain's output hypothesis from many years ago, which sounds very simple, through producing language, language acquisition may occur. And yet at the time, it wasn't all that simple because there was such a drive towards comprehension-based or input-based language learning. A lot of this was influenced by Stephen Krashen, who was an American applied linguist, who said that really the only way we learn language is through comprehension. And then Merrill Swain came along based on results from immersion programs that had been fairly input-driven. And she showed that no, in fact, there's so much French that they're not learning, and so they need to produce language a lot more than they are. And what's good is that immersion really lends itself to this, because when we teach subject matter, there are just multiple opportunities for language production. So there are lots of opportunities for students to use language. At the same time, there's a paradox here, because the paradox is that to improve students' proficiency, students need to use the language extensively. But to use a language extensively requires fairly high levels of proficiency. So the paradox is, how do you get students to use a language that they only know partially? okay, and that they're still learning? How can they be full participants of language production and language interaction in the classroom if they don't yet know the language? And this is where teachers come in and have a huge role to play in what we call scaffolding, okay, providing students with help so that they can produce language that they would be unable to produce on their own. So, language production, and I'm sure I don't have to convince you of the importance of language production, and yet at the same time, from a theoretical perspective, it's very important to do this because there are still theorists out there that say that language acquisition is largely input driven, that we just need to provide rich input and language acquisition will occur. So in fact, what Swain said years ago was that comprehension involves semantic processing. To understand the language, we can bypass the grammar and we can figure out the meaning thanks to our pragmatic knowledge, situational cues, and we don't need precise grammatical knowledge to understand the language, in this case, Gaelic. And this is good. This is why immersion works. The fact is we can teach content without students knowing the whole language. They can figure it out because they engage in what we call semantic processing. But what Swain said was that we need production because production pushes us towards what's called syntactic processing, not just semantic processing. It's as we produce language that we become more aware of what it is we don't know about language and what we need to know, and pushes us to test hypotheses about the language. And this is really what drives language learning, this kind of production where we're pushed to figure out what it is we don't know and to test hypotheses about it. So it's clear in immersion, we need both comprehension, we need production, but what was found in early studies in Canadian French immersion classrooms was that there was actually very little production going on in these classrooms. I'm not sure what it's like in your classrooms. I know that here it's changed. There's a lot more production, but initially it was found that students were giving very short answers, a lot of yes, no, we, no, very short answers without being pushed to produce more. Okay, so this is a problem, and there's a drive, of course, to make sure that students are indeed producing the language, because this didn't come across in initial research studies of the immersion programs. And I just want to mention that the French immersion programs in Canada are probably one of the most widely researched educational phenomena on the planet, because parents were so concerned about sending their children to French immersion programs. They were terrified that the children might lose their English, for one thing. And that became very clear at the beginning that no, they maintained their first language, which at this point in time, at the beginning of these programs, was English. But there was less focus on the quality of French, which had certain gaps, especially in sociolinguistics and grammatical knowledge. Here I want to mention the use of English in Gaelic immersion. I'm not exactly sure how your programs work. In Canadian immersion programs, it's quite separate. So there are separate spaces for the French language, and there are separate spaces for the English language. And there's a real drive to also do a lot of cross-linguistic pedagogy so that students are able to make comparisons across languages, because this can really drive biliteracy development forward. But at the same time, there's a lot of talk now about translanguaging and the importance of using or allowing students to use their whole linguistic repertoire. And here, both Professor Dedek and myself, in our experiences here in North America, we tend to be against translanguaging because we think it's really important to have spaces for the minority language, okay? So immersion teachers, you have multiple scaffolding strategies at your disposal to ensure sustained use of Gaelic. And I want to talk to you about some of those strategies with the goal to minimizing the use of English. This is important because what we have found in research, I think this is the case in Scotland, it's certainly the case here in North America, that as students progress through the programs, by the time they're in secondary level, they use English a lot more. And what we've also found is that as students use more and more English, there's a plateau effect in their development of the minority language. So in your case, a plateau effect in Gaelic, if they're able to use English more and more. So anytime there's competition in school between languages, of course, the socially more dominant language tends to predominate, and that's English. So there's a bit of conflict between minority languages and majority languages in school situations that we need to take into account. Yet there are researchers who suggest that students should be allowed to use English to work out complex ideas in immersion programs. Clearly, use of English facilitates comprehension. But at the same time, we're quite against this idea of letting students use English to work through complex ideas, because we think that the depth of processing that's involved by pushing them to use the minority language to process complex content is going to contribute to language acquisition. And this is based on the theory of depth of processing. Depth of processing is the extent to which a learner engages with new information and links it to other relevant information. So there's shallow levels of processing and there's deep processing. Deep processing is more certain of leading to storage in long-term memory and acquisition. So shallow levels of processing involve short-term memory. They require less elaboration, less analysis, and they reduce the likelihood of retention, meaning that it's harder to retrieve this kind of information because it's not stored in long-term memory. With greater depth of processing, there are cognitive processes that are engaged that facilitate greater memory access and make the information more readily accessible. And so what this means is that if English is used for the purpose of working through complex ideas, then deep levels of processing will occur in English and shallow levels will occur in the minority language, okay? And this isn't what we want. Students already access English quite easily, and we want them to be able to access more automatically the minority language. And so we need to really kind of train them to not shy away from using Gaelic to process complex information. So the kind of scaffolding that I'm going to talk about today we usually divide it into two different types, reactive scaffolding or a reactive approach to scaffolding and a proactive approach. So we'll start with a reactive approach, and these are scaffolding techniques that involve effective questioning techniques and also corrective feedback to make sure that oral production in the classroom is a key source of learning. And I'll also touch upon a proactive approach, which involves planned instruction that involves planning a progression that develops students' metalinguistic awareness and above all gives them opportunities for practice in meaningful contexts. And when I talk about meaningful context, I really mean, the subject matter class. Or it could be the language arts class with a thematic focus. What's important to keep in mind throughout my presentation, even though I've divided it into a reactive approach and a proactive approach, that in the most effective teaching, these approaches need to be presented in tandem. It's hard to do proactive teaching without the reactive approach, and there's no point in doing a reactive approach without having planned it in terms of the curriculum. Okay, and I think this will become clearer as I go through the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to start with ways to scaffold. This is the reactive approach. and we'll look at the right kinds of how to ask effective questions of our students, how to use a range of feedback types, and how to plan meaningful opportunities for practice through what we call the CAPA model. And I'll explain that in more detail as we get there. As throughout. Okay, so I'll start with questions. Questioning techniques are so important because they push students to clarify and elaborate their ideas in ways that require higher order thinking and more complex language, okay? And this is so important. As I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of research showing that students were giving a lot of yes answers, very, very short answers, and weren't being pushed to use more complex language, and therefore weren't being pushed either to engage in more higher order thinking. So back in the 70s, there was a very seminal study that was done in the UK of classrooms showing that there's a typical three-part question sequence that teachers use. So they ask a question, the initiating move, student responds, and the teacher evaluates, okay? So here's an example, and you'll see it will come to this example again, because this is actually so the teacher says, how would he be feeling? And the student says he would be very worried. And the teacher says, worried. That's a good word. Okay. Now, this has been criticized for obvious reasons. I'm sure in your teacher education programs, you've learned that this kind of questioning really is teacher-centered, but it's useful because it helps us to monitor students' understanding, and we need to monitor students' understanding. It's criticized, though, because it tends to engage, as you saw in those examples, it engages students only minimally. And also, there's some very interesting research that shows that an overuse of evaluative comments like, oh, very good, that's great, actually can sort of inhibit learning opportunities because it serves this finale function that precludes any elaboration. And you'll see this in an example I'm about to give, where a teacher is always saying very good, but then kind of jumping to the next one, not allowing anybody to kind of reflect. So what's promoted, and this is so important, is asking elaboration questions. These are follow-up questions that require some sort of elaboration, okay, and avoid evaluation. Or there could be evaluation such as, yeah, that's a really good idea, but how could we elaborate on that? What do you mean by that? Why do you think that? Can you be more specific? And it's very important to get students used to this kind of question so that they're prepared to go a little bit further, because it pushes them, as I said, to use more complex language, but also to engage in more critical thinking. What I want to do now is give an example of some questions that don't work very well. And I just want you to know that this is data from myself. When I was a teacher, I was videotaped with a few other teachers to make a video for teacher training purposes. So I had access afterwards to long pieces of film and transcribed data of myself. And I wrote a book in French about pedagogy for immersion, and I wanted to show examples of really good questioning. And I took this as an example because at first I thought, yeah, I really planned these questions. So, but you'll see what's missing. You'll see that there are follow-up questions that are missing. So this was a discussion with students in grade 8. So it means they're 13, 14 years old. And we were studying a novel called Max. Max was a character who was suspected of stealing some important information from a university, somebody's thesis, I think, and he was being pursued by the police, but he was completely innocent. But he wanted to capture the person that had actually taken these data, or the thesis. So he's hiding in an aquarium. That's a picture of the aquarium in Quebec City. And I thought I had this great idea that I was going to ask my students how they would feel if they were Max. Like, what would he be feeling while he spent the night hiding all alone in this the theater of the aquarium, knowing that he was being pursued by the police, you know? I said, pretend you're Max and you sneaked into the aquarium, you go into the theater and it's empty because there's nobody. There are no meetings going on and you have to spend the night all alone, except for the fish. What would you think about if you were Max? Tim. And Tim says, after the night where you're going to pass. Now, you have to remember that this was in French. This was a French immersion class, so I've translated it into English, and I've tried to preserve the errors. So you can see that, you know, there's some problem. It's not entirely clear after the night where you're going to pass. And I just say, yes. Okay, Liz, next. Liz says, inside the morning, like if you went outside and if someone is going to see you. And again, I say, yes, maybe. What would his emotions be? I keep asking people, students, what his emotions be? Someone says fear. And I say, okay, maybe fear. What else? Someone says confused. And I say, he's confused. Yes. What else? Someone says angry. And I say, very angry. And then it goes on like this. And basically, you can see it's kind of obvious that the point here, the question is good. Like, how would you feel? What would he be feeling? But when people say things like confused, or he would be confused, or he would be fearful, you have to say, well, can you explain that? What would he be afraid of? Why would he be worried? What exactly is he thinking? And there's no pushing going on here. And so what I thought initially was a good example of questions turned out to be a good example of really bad questions, because only the first questions were planned and the follow-up questions were not planned. It's just kind of like, what do you think? Yes, good. Yes, good. Next, next, next. And I think this happens quite a bit, and we have to try to avoid it. And plus, I thought my goal here in asking the question was to get students to talk. If we take me out of this, that's all that's left, right? So I'm doing the talking, and this happens a lot, I think, in immersion classrooms and in classrooms in general, where teachers do a fair amount of the talking. And here you have examples of students using short answers: fear, confused, angry, yes. And we have to do more to push students to produce language, okay? So that's it for the questioning part. I'm going to move right into corrective feedback. And corrective feedback is similar to questions in a way because it involves pushing students to go a little bit further. Okay, so corrective feedback is the term that we use to refer to the responses that teachers give to student errors during oral interaction. So it's very simple as a definition. And yet it's such a fundamental part of teaching. Here I'm using the term corrective feedback because we try to avoid the term error correction, because the idea is that teachers can't actually correct the error. All they can do is provide feedback to a student. It's the student that needs to correct the error. So we want to give the right kind of feedback so the student can self-repair. And I know this is challenging in some contexts, but we know from research for the past 25 years, there's been a great deal of research on this showing how effective it is. What's interesting about feedback is that it provides teachers with a way to provide scaffolding that provides language assistance while we're focusing on content. Okay. Often teachers say, okay, if I'm teaching history, I'm not going to give feedback. I'll just do it during the language class. And that's not the way to proceed. This is an opportunity to integrate language and content. And we know from research that providing feedback strategically promotes language growth. And there are several meta-analyses that show that providing corrective feedback is more effective than not providing it. And this is important because, again, I mentioned the work that was done earlier saying that we only learn language by comprehending. That same research said, don't bother correcting students because it's not useful. And we know now that that's not true, that it's more useful to provide feedback than it is to not provide feedback. Now, what's important here is that I don't want you to leave the session thinking that you have to correct everything, because that would be impossible and not fun for anybody. And you also need to know that the purpose isn't to to prevent errors, because when students make errors, it actually shows they're learning, they're trying to do something. We say that students are testing their hypotheses about language. And so making errors is fine. It's part of learning, right? But if we want it to be part of learning, the student's hypotheses need to be confirmed or disconfirmed through corrective feedback if we want the errors to be transitional. In other words, temporary, because we also know from research in French immersion that a lot of these errors without any feedback tend to appear kind of permanent, what we say fossilized. Okay, so the timing, this is the tricky part for teachers, because almost all of the research says that the most effective way to provide feedback is when students actually have something meaningful to say, okay? And that's hard for some teachers because we're happy when our students are communicating, so we don't want to interrupt them. What I'm going to try to do today is show you ways of giving helpful feedback that don't necessarily interrupt the communication. They actually help sustain the communication and keep it going. Some researchers, this is called transfer appropriate learning. They say that if language that's noticed during meaningful interaction is more likely to be noticed in similar contexts of communication, rather than, how can I say this? If students are only given information about language during decontextualized language lessons, then it's in those moments when they're going to notice that language the most. But if it's in a context of interaction and they're given feedback, it's easier to retain that information in similar communicative interactions. So what we also know from recent research is that giving feedback immediately is more effective than delayed. So I know many teachers think, okay, I don't want to interrupt students, so I'm going to give them, some feedback at the end of the day. I'll make mental notes or literally write notes and tell them about it later on. But the research suggests that when you give feedback later on, this can contribute to learners' declarative knowledge and can become part of their metalinguistic awareness, but it doesn't contribute to their procedural knowledge and therefore doesn't really contribute to their more spontaneous production. So I just want to take a moment here to explain. You may have already heard about the distinction between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge, but it's very important, and I want to stop at this slide and just talk a little bit about skill acquisition theory. Skill acquisition means, language is a skill that we acquire, and how do we acquire it? We acquire it through use or practice and feedback. Okay, so that practice and feedback are key to learning a skill. If you think of other skills, you can think of, learning how to play a musical instrument, learning how to play a sport. We need lots of practice and we benefit from feedback. And many psychologists say that learning a language, a second language, is very similar to this. So declarative knowledge is kind of static knowledge that's stored in long-term memory. So when it comes to language, it might be grammatical rules or word definitions. Whereas procedural knowledge is accessing that knowledge, okay? So it's retrieval of knowledge from long-term memory, and it's applied spontaneously to language use, okay? So it's two very different. Now that we often say, knowing what, that's declarative knowledge, but knowing how is procedural knowledge. And many of you will be familiar with this because you may have, I'm not sure if you have much of if you teach grammar explicitly or not, but if you teach grammar explicitly, sometimes students can absorb this and they can do well on a grammar test. They might be able to conjugate verbs, but they're not reproducing them accurately in oral interaction. And this means that they have declarative knowledge, but not the procedural knowledge. And this is really what we want to develop in schools is procedural knowledge, okay? And to do this, students need to use the language and we need to provide feedback. Okay, so in our work on corrective feedback, we've come up with two different families of corrective feedback, and this is all based, we didn't invent this, this was based on intensive observations of immersion teachers and how they actually provide feedback. So they either they can use reformulations, and this involves giving the students the correct form. This is through explicit correction or recasts, and it's this kind of feedback I want to really encourage you to use more of. It's what we call prompts, where you don't give the right form, but you push students to self-repair, okay? And these involve clarification requests, metalinguistic clues, elicitation, and repetition of error. So we're going to look at each one of these types of feedback. So reformulations, remember, it's just giving the student the right form. In this example, the student says, we cut the straws into different thicknesses and attaches the straws with tape. And the teacher just stops and says, David, excuse me, I want you to use the word lengths. You cut the straws into different lengths, not thicknesses. So explicit correction just means not X, don't say X, say Y. And I'm not giving you this as an excellent example of feedback. In fact, we didn't find it occurred a lot in the classrooms, but just so that you know the terminology. In terms of reformulations, what's used a lot more is what we call recasting. Here we have the teacher that says, what did you find out about the Vikings? And the student says they live in Europe. And the teacher just says they lived in Europe, changing to the past tense. And what you'll see as we go through this is that modifications like this are hard. In fact, you're going to see this one on a video. It's hard for students to notice that there's been feedback. The difference between they live in Europe and they lived in Europe is very hard to perceive. So I'm going to continue, and we'll come back to the problematic issue of recast. So prompts are when we don't give the right form, and we try to get students to self-repair. Here we have a student who says when they fire the books, and the teacher just says, "What do you mean when they fire the books?" This can be very powerful type of feedback. What do you mean by that? And this is an interesting example that you'll also see in a video. What the student means is when they burn the books, okay? And the teacher knows that. So the teacher could have easily said, and believe me, when I was a teacher, it's probably the kind of thing I would do because it just moves you faster through the program. Oh, you mean when they burn the books? And what's important here is to remember not to do the work for the students, because the teacher knows that the student has already been familiarized with the word burn. She doesn't have to give the word. She wants the student to produce it. Another prompt is a simple repetition of error. Here a student says a jump, and the teacher says a jump, okay? Which can also be very powerful. I don't have an example on video of this one, but sometimes students don't exactly hear what they've just said, and so it's not a bad idea to repeat what they've said so they can register what they've said and try to find the right way. Metalinguistic clue is more explicit. Here a student says, we pick up my aunt at the airport yesterday, and the teacher just says, oh, you need the past tense. Okay, that's much more explicit. Elicitation is also a powerful one because it's just asking students if there's a better way to say that. And here we have a student saying, I think we'll see this on the video too, they went into the cabane, and cabane is a French word for tree house, and the teacher knows that the student knows that word. And instead of saying, yes, you're right, they went into the tree house, she says, what's another word for cabane? So getting the student to do the work, very important. So this study that we did of feedback that involved many teachers, resulted in this distribution of feedback. So what you see in blue here, or it's kind of a blue, I'm not sure what shade of blue that is, it's recast. So teachers used more than half the time they were recasting, and the other types were distributed fairly evenly. And this was found also in subsequent studies that were done in many, many different second language contexts, showing a similar breakdown. The bottom line is that teachers love recasts, so we need to find out why, and we need to also know whether or not they're effective, because from our research, they didn't really look that effective. And I just want to add this for you to peruse, because I think my conclusion to all of this is that teachers need to use a variety of feedback types and not over focus on using always the same type of feedback. So an ideal distribution would be using different types of feedback in a variety of ways. Okay, why so many recasts? What we found is that there was a lot of repetition going on in the classrooms because teachers are scaffolding. So teachers scaffold by repeating what students just said, and this is okay. We called it non-corrective repetition. So here a student says, depends who's teaching, and the teacher says right away, depends who's teaching. But they also seem to react in the same way when it's a recast. So here a student says, because you don't like books, and the teacher says he doesn't like books, okay? So this happens a lot, and it means that students themselves are kind of left to their own devices to figure out if the teacher is correcting or just repeating. Are they saying the same thing but in a different way? Are they correcting me? Or maybe they don't hear the correction at all. As in this example, this is an example from a first language context where a little boy says to his mother, very proudly, I putted the plates on the table. This is from the Lightbound and Spada book. And the mother says, you mean I put the plates on the table? And the little boy says, no, I putted them there all by myself. Okay? So the mother's trying to recast, but the child doesn't hear the morphological change. And the child is focused on meaning. And this is good because we want our students to focus on meaning, of course, so that they're understanding. But at the same time, I believe this happens a lot in immersion classrooms where they're not hearing this type of correction. And so maybe it's a good idea to use other types of correction. So I'm going to show you a video that I've compiled, trying to contrast to show the extent to which teachers repeat well-formed utterances, but also the fact that they recast a lot of ill-formed utterances. These children are in 4th grade, meaning they're about 9, I think, 9 to 10 years old. So just put yourselves in the position of a 9-year-old and ask yourself if you would really hear the correction or if you would really know. I also just want to mention, I said that my research was done in French immersion classrooms, and some of my work has been done within the French class and also in the English class. And in this context, in Montreal, we have classrooms that are a bit like two-way immersion, so that we have Anglophone and Francophone students in the same classrooms. And so I'm going to show you an English class with the English teacher, and you just need to know that it's a mixture of French-speaking and English-speaking students.
Volcano was going to erupt at 12 o'clock. How did they?
Fix them and put them on the other side.
Lifted them up and he transferred them out to the other side. Jessica? Yes.
Don't like
He doesn't like books.
well, in the beginning, it's like a farmer that wanted to give a favor.
Yes, there was a farmer boy, young boy, who gave a note to the boy to Jack and Annie and to give to the silkweaver. And the silkweaver.
Pyramids.
Pyramids, good.
There's a lot of
Lot of we tried to find out about the Vikings. What did you find out, Taylor? They lived in Europe, so we're here in North America. Jonathan,
they're gonna get killed soon.
they're gonna get killed, like what that is?
It's kind of like a pie.
It's kind of like the pot. But
I have-
this cobbler is a man. David, why do you think it was good advice to go home?
It's that they don't get in.
They won't die? Do you think there was something bad to happen? Besides me.
It's something that. That.
Something that's worth a lot. Anything
Anything
else? Very good. Thank you, Julian. Jonathan, what else?
Depends who's teaching.
Depends who's teaching.
Okay, so you can see that there's a lot, it's good scaffolding. Teachers need to do this, but it's just hard for the students to kind of discern whether or not the teacher is just confirming the meaning or at the same time confirming meaning and maybe correcting an error. Okay, so all this just to say that they're not necessarily the best type of feedback. They're certainly frequent. What we know is that recasts can help move lessons ahead. Because they can help students express themselves when what they're trying to say is beyond their abilities. And I have a really good example here of that. These are, again, I think they're grade 4 students, so they're 9 or 10, talking about the water cycle. The teacher says, how do they transport the wood? And this student says, you put the wood in the water and takes tree to and place and another person who puts the wood. So it's, if I can say, discombobulated. It's hard to take that and really, provide useful feedback. So the teacher seizes the opportunity to give a recast because she just wants to help the student say what he wants to say. She says they put the wood in the river so it gets transported from one place to another, okay? So that recasts can be very useful in situations like that. Others can be terribly ambiguous. So in this case, the teacher says, why do you, and they're talking about a drop of water that goes through the water cycle. Why do you think she wants to warm up? And a student says, because she has too cold. And the teacher says, because she is too cold. So this is translated from French, but in Romance languages like Spanish and French, they often say I have cold instead of I am cold, or I have hunger instead of I am hungry, and that's what's happening here. But it's imperceptible, right? Because if the teacher says that this child says she has too cold, and the teacher says because she is too cold, the learner can't perceive this. And so what this could be doing is reinforcing an error that is really problematic because it's there to start with and needs to be dealt with more explicitly. And so you need more, you would have feedback like, here I would suggest a prompt like, she has too cold, really sort of accentuating what the student's saying. And some students are going to know, because she is cold, because they've heard this rule over and over again, but they need to be pushed to really use it instead of having the teacher do the work for the student here. Okay, so the reason we encourage more prompts is that after a recast, if there is some sort of correction, all the student can do is repeat. And we're not sure about the value of repetition in that kind of context, but after a prompt, a student needs to self-repair, and this involves a deeper level of processing, which means that what we say is that when a learner has to retrieve information, learners remember information better when they play an active part in producing it rather than having an external source produce it for them. We remember best what we produce ourselves and retrieve. And I've said this before, retrieval from existing knowledge, more so than a repetition, really strengthens associations in memory so that subsequent retrieval is going to be quick. okay, much more quicker. If this happens over time. It's not just a one-shot deal, but it's this idea of pushing students in an ongoing manner rather than repeating what the right phrase might be for them. So now I'm going to show you, I think it's the same teacher, prompting. Just have a look at how she pushes her students, and you'll see that she's not interrupting the communication. The students are still keen on producing.
Who was in the salon? What's that in English? Clothing? Living room. Who was in the living room? And who was in the kitchen? You were in the kitchen. Where was your dog? With you. And what did your dog do? Six months. What's moi in English? Months. 6 months. Is that old for a dog? Yeah. So a class d'aller at home. What does a class d'aller? Does that mean instead? Instead of going to their house, you think they're going to go to another place? Okay, who else? Very good.
They went in cabin.
They went in their cabin, and what's another word for cabin? In their shops, in the tree house. Go ahead. When they what? They fire. They fire. No, let me first say it in another way. Explain it to me in another way. When they put fire on the books. What's that when we put fire to make a fire? What do we do? When we put things in the fire, we say we burn things. Good. Continue.
Okay, and in this last example, what I really like about it, it's hard to hear it, but first of all, the girl, her peers correct her. They come up with the word burn, and that's okay. But she also uses the word burn and continues her story. And she says when they burned it, the guy just burned the books that he didn't write. He kept the books that he wrote. So she corrects herself. And this can be seen really as the ultimate goal of giving corrective feedback. We want to really, we want students to be able to self-correct, and prompts can kind of push learners to do that. And here's an example of it there, staying in the past tense. Okay, so there's been a great deal of research looking at the different effects of feedback. I think I said right at the beginning that research has shown that giving feedback is more effective than not giving feedback. And the good news is that comparisons of recasts, prompts, and explicit corrections show that all feedback types have significant effects. In fact, meaning that all those feedback types are more effective than no feedback. At the same time, however, the research shows that students receiving prompts or explicit correction demonstrated more gains than those receiving recasts. So all feedback can be considered useful. Prompts seem to be promising. And what we also know from some research is that prompts appear to be more effective than recasts for younger learners, because younger learners don't have those analytic abilities to perceive the recast in the input. And so they really benefit from being pushed to self-repair instead of having to rely on their own analytic abilities to detect the correction in a recast that may be perceived simply as a confirmation of meaning. The research on preferences is interesting because this research has shown that students tend to, usually this research is done with questionnaires. Students usually express an interest in receiving corrective feedback with a preference for more salient types of feedback, like prompts. But teachers claim reluctance. They say they prefer not to give feedback because they believe their students do not want to be corrected. But students are saying they would like to be corrected, but their teachers don't correct them. And because of this mismatch, what this means is that teachers really need to initiate discussions with their students about feedback, about the different types of feedback that I've presented in this presentation, and also about their benefits. It's really useful to discuss this. I've worked with teachers that have actually put posters up around their classrooms, illustrating the different types of feedback, so that students know that feedback is there to help them learn the language, and it's not there to somehow put them down. Very quickly, I just want to go over this. I love the name of this article. It's called The Power of Feedback, and this was done in an educational journal about education in general, not just second language learning. And it said that feedback in general is one of the most powerful influences on learning, can only build on something, not useful when there's no initial learning or just surface information, and it's intertwined with instruction in a way that transforms new instruction in a way that informs the learner about more than just correctness. And what this means is integration of feedback into teaching in general means that proactive and reactive approaches really need to be implemented in tandem as complementary. So I want to give you an example now. I still have a little bit of time of the proactive approach. Do I still have a little bit of time, Anna?
Yes, absolutely.
You just keep going.
Okay, so the proactive approach, this involves planning, okay? The corrective feedback, questioning, it appears kind of spontaneous. But the proactive approach really involves planning activities that push learners to develop their metalinguistic awareness while also giving them opportunities to practice. So it's giving them declarative knowledge and opportunities to proceduralize that knowledge. And with my colleague, Diane Teddick, we promote this 4-phase sequence that begins with a contextualization phase and followed by awareness phase, followed by a practice phase, and then followed by an autonomy phase. And so the acronym is CAPA, and we call this the CAPA model or the CAPA sequence. So what's important about this, so CAPA is a way of integrating, it gives teachers a tool for integrating language and content. Often immersion teachers are told you need to focus on both language and content. Immersion teachers are content and language teachers. Initial research showed that teachers tended to separate content teaching from language teaching, and research now is saying, no, it's got to be more integrated. So that raises the burning question of how can we do that? And this is our response, the sequence, this 4-phase model, where in the contextualization phase, we start with a context based on the content that we're teaching, and then we zoom in on language in the awareness phase and also the practice phase, and then come back to the content in the autonomy phase. And so this is meant to look a little bit like an hourglass, just to show that we start big with content, zoom in on language, and then zoom back out to come back to the content. And I'm going to give you a concrete example now that was produced by teachers that I worked with. So these teachers are grade 4 teachers. So again, the students are 9, 10 years old. And in the sequence that they designed, the content focus, this is part of our approach to counterbalanced instruction. There's always a content objective and there's always a language objective. Here, the content focus in this history class was about Jacques Cartier, a French explorer, and his 3 different voyages to New France, which is today basically Quebec. And the content objectives are really on the sequence of events and cause and effect relationships in history. The language focus is on what's called in French the passé composé, which is a bit like in Spanish the preterite. It's like the simple past in English, except it's complicated in French because the passé composé, the composé means that there's an auxiliary verb that goes with the past participle, and the auxiliary can either be the verb to be or to have. And this is a little bit hard for learners, and so their focus is on trying to show learners, give learners opportunities to distinguish between the passé composé that uses to have as an auxiliary and those that use to be as an auxiliary. So in the contextualization phrase, this is where you start normally by a text that you're already using in your content teaching. But in the text, the target features that you want to highlight have been made maybe more frequent. You may have doctored the text to some extent, or just made the forms look more salient through what we call input enhancement by underlining them or making them appear in bold, for example. So before the student, because this is just about context, the students aren't seeing the language at all. They're not seeing the text. In fact, this text was an oral text. So the teachers made a video where it was actually really quite clever. I'm going to show you part of it. It was a time-lapsed video that they animated and narrated the voyages of Jacques Cartier. And in this narration, you can imagine there are lots of past tense verbs, and many of them use either to be or to have. And so students are focused only on the content here. They're just trying to learn about these voyages that he made, 3 voyages in total. I'm just going to play a very small part. The video they made for the students, of course, is in French. It doesn't matter. I don't think some of you might know some French. And even if you don't, you'll probably notice how well they articulate. It's really a good example of comprehensible input. And plus, it's the input is being illustrated through the time-lapsed animation at the same time. So I'll play a bit of this.
Jacques Cartier. Au 16e siècle, les pays d'Europe se sont lancés dans une course pour conquérir le Nouveau Monde. L'Espagne et le Portugal ont été les premiers pays à découvrir l'or du Nouveau Monde et ils sont devenus très riches. Alors, d'autres pays d'Europe, comme la France et l'Angleterre, ont voulu leur faire compétition. Le roi de France, François Ier, voulait de l'or, mais aussi de la soie et des épices qu'il pouvait trouver en Asie. Il y avait une route pour aller en Asie par la terre, mais elle était bloquée par les guerres. Il y avait une route pour aller en Asie par la mer au sud, mais elle était contrôlée par le Portugal. La France, l'Espagne et l'Angleterre étaient sûrs qu'en naviguant vers l'ouest, ils pourraient se rendre en Asie. C'est à Jacques Cartier que le roi François Ier a demandé de chercher un chemin vers la Chine en passant par le Nouveau Monde.
Okay, so that's an example of developing a context. And of course, students, they spend several days, analyzing the content of the video. And then for the awareness phase, students are finally shown the text. They see the text on an interactive whiteboard where the verbs have been highlighted. They're in bold. And they kind of talk about the verbs. So this is really the analytic part. And students are led to notice that some verbs take one type of auxiliary and other verbs take another. You can see in this little example, and they're asked to compare these examples and also to make up a list of which verbs take which auxiliary so that they can use this list in the subsequent tasks that they're going to be asked to use. And this too takes a while. I'm going through this very quickly. Teachers probably spent a couple of weeks at least on this unit. So making them aware of this difference is one thing, but we have to get them using it, okay? And again, and benefiting from corrective feedback. So what the teachers did here is that they had 5 different images related to this, these events, handed out these images to students who each had to write a sentence about the image that they got. And then the students had to circulate in the class and find the other students who had the same image, and together they had to construct a text about the image that they presented to the class. So an historical description of more than one sentence in this case. It was really a short text. They present the account to the class, and this gives the teacher an opportunity to give them feedback on the content, but also on the language and specifically on the verb tenses that they're using. So that's very structured practice, but of course what we want in immersion is for students to be able to use language in more spontaneous ways and with a little bit less scaffolding. So that's the autonomy phase, where teachers are encouraged to use some activity that's already in your curriculum that you want to focus on, but to use as a means to focus more on language. So in this case, part of the curriculum was that students needed to know about timelines and how to create a timeline. So they were asked in small groups to discuss and determine what they thought were the most important events in Quartier's life, and then to make a timeline, to label the timeline, to actually draw the timeline in small groups. And again, they would present the timeline to the whole class. And again, this gives an opportunity to the teacher to give feedback on the content and also on the language use. And then the timelines are presented all around the classroom, okay? So, as I said, I worked with teachers for a few years on doing this kind of thing. And so I can say personally that they really enjoyed this, because all of these were teachers of language arts and history, but they never thought of combining the two. And they were very pleased to be able to finally integrate their French focus into the history class. And their students apparently really liked it too. One student says, "I've been teaching social studies in French for several years, and I wondered if it would be better to teach it in English. Now I'm reassured and motivated to continue in French." Another said, "Some students have a lot of difficulty in French, but were able to really do well in terms of grammar in French and the historical content. Even if we focused on French and sometimes on history, it really helped a lot." And another said, "I really liked learning about the CAPA model for integrating French and social studies. It's simple to understand and makes everything easier to do." So we have a lot of testimonials, and we also have a lot of research done in the Canadian context that looked at the effects of instruction that was based on the CAPA model, comparing groups that got CAPA-based instruction with groups that were just getting their regular curriculum without the language focus at the same time. And in these studies, there's a set of about 6 or 7 studies. Here this gives you an idea of the kinds of things we focused on grammatically. So conditional, grammatical gender, past tense, verbs of motion, second-person pronouns, and also derivational morphology. And what was found is very clearly that students getting their curriculum, the content along with a focus on language, definitely improved more than students who were just expected to pick up the target forms on their own. And this is kind of a leitmotif of immersion, is that teachers are often told that students will just pick up the language on their own. So my conclusion is simply that nothing really comes for free. Immersion is sometimes referred to as a 2-for-1 approach, implying that students learn subject matter while gaining an additional language for free. But as we all know, nothing comes for free. So by learning content through Gaelic, students just don't pick up Gaelic without lots of effort. Attention needs to be drawn to the Gaelic language, which needs to be manipulated and enhanced during content teaching in ways that I've tried to present to you this evening. And that is my talk. I thank you very much. I also have I've written a few books you can take note of. I've also provided Anna with the PDF of the presentation, so you'll be able to access that as well. So we'll move on now to Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing and move on to Q&A.
Merci, Mhion-chànan. That was fantastic, Roy. Just so much to think about and to process myself. Mhion-chànan Gàidhlig, thank you so much. It's been so interesting and rich, this session, and added with what we heard from Diane a month ago. There's so much for us to take away and to consider and to plan for in our own classrooms. And I think the testimonials in your final couple of slides there speak volumes as the effectiveness of this process and where we have yet to go in some of our classrooms. So thank you again very much. We'll have a chance for a Q&A. There's already a couple have come in. Mhion-chànan gan hula duine ha cáilearin nach sa hanig cáilearin am dos gan de charta réh cears go mór sa charta duine agus gan dúr síse cearst udat as. So hear me here. Thank you very much to everyone who's come along this evening. I'm sure that you'll have all enjoyed it just as much as we have, and you'll have taken something away as well. In the chat, you'll see some information coming up. There are 2 sessions in particular, one next week about rural and sustainable education, which is done by our sister core hub for rural and sustainable education in Dumfries, but it'll be particularly pertinent. It's with the Professor Morag Redford and with Anne Patterson, who are both well known to us within teacher education at UHI, and anyone who lives in a rural location, this will definitely be right up your strata, so I would make sure that you sign up to that. Also, our 3rd Gaelic event will be in a month's time with Dr. Sheila MacLeod, and there should be information of that popping up into the chat as well as more general information about our teacher education courses. So please make sure you grab all those links. If not, we'll also be sharing it on email alongside Professor Lyster's presentation and any other additional links. So I don't know if you've had a wee chance there to look over any questions that popped up. We do have 2, and incidentally, they're both from 2 of our lecturers. So I'll go with Diane's first. At the moment, our education system in Scotland is engaged in a curriculum improvement cycle focused on Gaelic literacy and literacy development. As a Gaelic high school teacher, I sometimes feel that the current curriculum outcomes and expectations don't always create space to effectively apply approaches that scaffold language acquisition. I would agree that's also the case in primary. In your experience, does the curriculum in Canadian schools, acknowledging it varies by province, provide opportunities to meaningfully engage in effective immersion education? If so, what qualities or structural features within the curriculum help support this? And how might we shape the Gaelic curriculum in Scotland to place these kind of strategies at the forefront of learning and teaching? I think that could be another PhD for you there, Roy. That's a meaty question, but so very relevant and pertinent. So you might want to give it a few seconds thought. It is quite big. So we're in a curriculum improvement cycle right now that is a long process, but we're reviewing our curriculum for excellence within Scotland, and as part of that, Gaelic and literacy development is getting a big light shone on it and an opportunity to really be renewed. So what does your experience tell you? Does the curriculum in Canadian schools provide opportunities to meaningfully engage in effective immersion education, or is it just as crowded?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. In my experience, I do find that it's a bit easier at the elementary level because the teachers are usually considered generalist teachers. So the same person who's teaching French language arts might be teaching science and also, the social studies class. So when I've worked with teachers like that, it's been much easier for them to integrate a focus on language. They're more in control of the timing of these subjects, and they can integrate a focus there instead of, focusing on language just in language arts. They can, maybe shorten language arts and then extend the focus on language into their social studies class. And they can do that. I've seen teachers do that very effectively. And I've also, and in the secondary level, that becomes harder to do because often the teachers are subject specialists and they're not the same person teaching French, the language arts in Gaelic isn't necessarily the same person teaching a subject. What I've tried to do in my work is focus a lot on teacher collaboration. And a lot of my work involved getting teachers to collaborate, sometimes across languages, like so that the immersion language and the English language teacher would collaborate on different literacy activities. And I've tried to promote that in high schools where the subject matter teacher might collaborate with the content teacher. And it's kind of an uphill battle. It's been very difficult to do that. I haven't been very successful in that. So I agree with the person expressing these challenges, and I don't have a magical response, but somehow it's got to be done, because that's how these programs can improve.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're all striving for that magic wand. And maybe one day, it might be Diane who asked the question, it might be her that finds it, but it's definitely a challenge. And well, it'll be interesting to see what happens as a result of our improvement cycle, and just what opportunities might arise. Thank you very much. The second question we have here, do different kinds of corrective feedback and their suitability depend on the age of the pupils? For example, many of our pupils arrive at their first year of schooling with no Gaelic language. In this scenario, is anything other than recast appropriate, especially considering they do not have the tools for self-correction and such? Or should we just give less corrective feedback at this stages?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Definitely with beginning learners, we use lots of recasting. What's interesting though, even from a beginning stage, well, not on day one, but let's say at the end of year one, students have already been exposed to certain basic elements of the Gaelic language. And at a certain point, to really draw their attention to language, prompting can be started even with younger learners, not on day one, but as I say, maybe day 100, because the younger learners, intuitively, we think we're going to recast younger learners and prompt older learners. And that doesn't really work according to the research, because what we have found actually is that older learners can benefit from either recasts or prompts. And it's because they can notice the modifications in the recast. Younger learners don't have the analytic skills to notice differences in recasts. So sometimes, I hate to say this, we might be doing more harm than good by recasting, because they could just think you're confirming what they just said. So it's not as easy as just saying, let's recast younger learners and prompt older learners. I think that at the beginning, recasting is so valuable. I gave an example of a phrase that, one could only recast. Another way to look at this is that if the error in question involves a binary distinction, let's say between to have and to be, auxiliaries like that. In French and Spanish, the verb to know has two different verbs. Trying to think of something in English that has a binary, or his and her, for example, which if there's a binary distinction, it's best not to recast, because students might just think you're saying the same thing in a different way. And if it's a binary, it's simple. If it's simple enough, if it's a difference between his and her, you can push, because at a certain point, students are going to become aware that, so if there's a mistake with the teacher, instead of saying, oh yeah, her, it's not a good example. My examples are better in French, sorry. But if it's a binary distinction between gender or auxiliaries, it's better at a certain point to push and to prompt rather than just to recast it, because I'm convinced in French, for example, that's a binary distinction, that teachers they always just recast gender errors. And I'm convinced that students just learn that it doesn't matter. You can say le or la, and it's the same thing, because if I say le, the teacher says la, and it just doesn't matter. So you kind of want to avoid that kind of ambiguity, even with young learners.
Yeah, to be explicit and clear that Marshall, like like this, and to be correct from the outset. Yeah. And I can't think of any examples off the top of my head in Gaelic either, but I can imagine myself in the classroom, and I think there is an intuitive kind of knowing who you've got in front of you and knowing their needs, their ability, and some of them are so fast, and then others like, okay, we're going to have to take a different route to get to that point of fluency. So it's so interesting, but also there are some that are some strategies that definitely work better for particular age groups. Our final question. Thank you for your answers so far. Where pupils have reached a plateau in their language acquisition and confidence in biliteracy, so age kind of 12 to 14, would you recommend stripping back writing and reading skills and refocusing on language acquisition through more active language engagement? Do you have any top tips? So they're a wee bit older, and they've reached a plateau with their confidence and language acquisition and biliteracy.
I would just hesitate to cut back on literacy activities, reading and writing. And yet, if from the beginning, teachers can follow a counterbalanced curriculum, such as I outlined it, then the students shouldn't be plateauing. And the key is to avoid the plateau effect somehow. But once they're there, I'm not sure what to say. The thing is, they need everything. They need it all, right? So maybe you could cut back on writing and working on oral a bit more, because in the end, students tend to write the way they speak. And so if they haven't mastered it orally, it's not a bad idea to backtrack and sort of revisit oral production.
That was one of the very first things I ever learned, was from a very experienced infant teacher, was that if it doesn't go in and come out orally correctly, it's not going to come out correctly on the page.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
And what I find fascinating with all the work that I've read from yourself and Dan is, and Anne said this yesterday, it's like a mirror, but when I was in class doing it, I had no idea. It was very intuitive, but now to come out and kind of go, oh,
you were doing it.
I was doing it, and I won't be alone tonight thinking the same thing. Like, oh, good. I think one of the people that were here said there was a light bulb moment. So I think that will be true of many. Thank you so much, Roy, for this evening. It has been just terrific to meet you in real life, as it were, online. We do hope you come to Sgafallachd one day. And I can't thank you enough for this session. It's enlightening and engaging, and has provided me, and I'm certain everyone else, with a lot to say and do in their class. You get lots of claps and thanks. So thank you very much.
I wish everyone all the best. And they're in a great career, and it's really, it's a lot of work, but it's worth it. Absolutely
is. More than time, Roy. And we'll I'll have to end this call, but myself and Anne might just jump on with you for 1 second.
Okay, so can I end? Oh, I'll just leave. Okay, got it. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Uair an tainn go carsten.